coming to this session, which is actually our fifth talk of the researcher series, which we're doing from the South Asian Women in Higher Education Network. I know I probably introduce myself in every session, but just in case we've got new people joining today, my name is Dr. Rumi Begum. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Westminster, which is based in London. I'm also the events manager for SAWHE, and as part of that role, I have been putting together this researcher series for 2026. So today I will be chairing or co-chairing this session with my colleague, Dr. Saima Rahman Khan. And to really just let you know, each time we keep saying this, we've been hearing from academic researchers, student researchers, and it's been amazing to have that environment to share that space. And our intention is that we don't only share research to gain knowledge, but it sort of gives us an opportunity to hear about different researchers and how they got to where they are right now. Of course, being in these sort of sessions, then it hopefully, we'd like to think, as time goes on, it kind of enables us to form connections, form networks, and possibly even future collaborations. Who knows? There's no pressure for anything, but certainly there is that space for that. We want to build this community as always. So if you have any ideas, when we put the feedback form on the chat, in the chat rather, it would be lovely to hear any sort of ideas that you might have. So I'm going to now pass over to Saima, who will introduce our fifth guest.
Thank you, Rumi, and thank you for putting together the SAWHE Researcher Series. It's been amazing in the last 4 sessions, and really looking forward to Adrija's session today. I'm Saima. I'm the founder of the South Asian Women in Higher Education Network, and I'm also a project manager working at the University of Manchester and also the NHS. And today I'll be co-chairing the session with Rumi. And a very warm welcome to our fifth speaker of the series, Dr. Adrija Dey from the University of Westminster in London. To give you a brief background of Dr. Adrija, she is a reader at the School of Social Sciences at the University of Westminster. She's the PI on the UKRI-funded research project called FemIDEAS, which is looking at decolonizing sexual and gender-based violence in higher education. Adrija is also the author of Nirbhaya, which is a new media and digital gender activism. And she's been a vocal campaigner against sexual misconduct in higher education, and also serves as the director of international knowledge exchange at the 1752 group. That's a lot of achievements, Adrija, and that's not ending yet. So Dr. Adrija is also the founder of the North-South Feminist Dialogue platform, which aims to foster transnational conversations, collaboration, and solidarity among activists and academics working on sexual and gender-based violence in higher education, both in the global North and the global South. So lots of fantastic work, Adrija, and we are very privileged to have you on the SAWHE Researcher Series, and looking forward to listening to your research. So without any further delay, I hand the platform to Adrija. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saima, for such a generous introduction, and for Rumi for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share my research with your amazing network of women. So I'm really, really glad to be here. And so today, because it's like a nice, comradely space, I thought it'll be, I didn't want to have a presentation and make it very formal. I just wanted to talk a little bit about my research, how I got there, and then take your questions. So I don't have any slides, but having said that, if there are any resources that you would like or anything that you need to know more about, like you want to know more about, just give me a shout and I can put like plenty of resources in the chat. So today I just wanted to talk to you about, though my current work is not in South Asia, but I started doing this work from India and I'm from there. So it is always my anchoring point. a lot of everything I learned about this topic was from my work in India, and I always go back to it, to the lessons learned, to how I did the research, and which like really, really informs my current work in the area. Um, so within the UK as well, in the last few years, like questions around gender-based violence, sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, staff-student sexual misconduct, questions around student safety has been widespread. Even like from earlier in the year, we have seen Oxford University like continuously in the news about not only cases of sexual violence, but how institutions have been complicit in covering up cases, how survivors have been silenced using mechanisms such as the use of NDAs, which are no longer permitted within higher education, but the various silencing mechanism continues, which includes like using legal threats, retaliation, people being pushed out of academia. So I think it is a really important conversation to have at the moment. And I don't know if you know about this. A few years ago, Al Jazeera did a podcast called Degrees of Abuse, where they called out powerful perpetrators within UK higher education who've been taking advantage for generations of their positions of power and abuse to silence. But most importantly, it also highlighted the cultures of silence and power dynamics which were upheld by the universities themselves, making these spaces violent, and even more violent for certain women and coming from marginalized locations. Um, but what was interesting was that after Degrees of Abuse, like many academics and practitioners across UK higher education started saying, when will UK have its Me Too moment? Or like when will higher education have its Me Too moment? Which was surprising to me because academia had already had its Me Too moment in India in 2017. There were like repeated call out movements like across Latin America. There was Ni Una Menos, which has been happening since 2015 in large parts of Latin America, which had huge effects on higher education, new policies, new practices being built. There was RE reference list around the same time in universities in South Africa. There was the Sex for Grades campaigns in Nigeria. So while these campaigns were not called #MeToo, it represented some of the same things. So then for people in the UK to say, when will higher education have its Me Too moment, and not know or be informed about the important debates that's raised by this global movements was very jarring to me. I was like, well, do these campaigns and voices only count if they are coming out from the global north? And why is still the discourses of the global north kind of considered as the predominant universal discourse, while voices, debates, important contributions in the global majority are still invisibilized within this conversation around, sexual and gender-based violence within higher education? And and that's basically forms the foundation of my work. So when I was doing this work in India, I was doing it in as a postdoc project in SOAS many years ago now. And while doing this work in India, and when I was talking about my project, a number of people who had lived experiences of harm within UK higher education started talking to me and wanting to know what happens in the UK. And coming from the global majority, I was like, well, in the global north, there must be great mechanisms to address sexual harassment. And then, much to my dismay, I realized that like actually most universities within the UK didn't even have a sexual harassment policy. It was deeply buried inside like equality and diversity policies, or on bullying and harassment policies. Many of these policies almost had like started with like what happens if you make a false allegation, almost like establishing that, of course, that is why people who experience harassment would approach wanting to report. Um, but also like, mechanisms like report and support, which like our university has as well, but in lots of universities, like, I said as a joke that you can't report and you can't find any support because universities implemented this as like a tick box mechanism, but didn't put any of the background support work and the background, infrastructure that is required to do this work. So my previous work and my current work in FemIDEAS, like a big part of that work is what can we learn from the work and activism and research and debates which is happening in the global majority, because we don't need to start this work from fresh. I'll give you an example. Last year, the OFS was, the conversations around having like an universal guideline that guides, university mechanisms across UK has been a very recent conversation. And it was only last year that the OFS brought the E6 guideline to, for sexual misconduct, but it's also like, again, a guideline. So then the implementation of it remains patchy. But this is a conversation which is happening in 2024, 25, 26, while in India, that conversation started in 1997 with the Vishaka judgment and the sexual harassment in the workspace. And I'll talk a bit more about that in my presentation. In South Africa, the conversation started around 1994 with the end of apartheid and the transformation of higher education. So there are a lot of the things that we think is new in the UK has already been discussed, debated, and implemented in the global south. And we're not like, glorifying it in India, because like, my research in many, many ways shows that, things that exist on paper hasn't been implemented on ground, but these conversations exist. And I think a part of the violence of academia is also invisibilization of these conversations. So my work is around, trying to kind of disrupt some of these like imperial geographies of knowledge production and bring attention to the debates and discourses and feminist activism, which is happening in the global majority, but also remembering to do that through redistribution and not through extraction, not going to the global majority and saying that we'll take all this knowledge and not give anything back to you, right? So my current project is called FemIDEAS, Decolonising Sexual and Gender-Based Violence in Higher Education, where we aim to do this work. We look at our fieldwork countries are Argentina, South Africa, and Nigeria. And in every single country that we've gone to, we've kind of, we've paid every single person who's been involved in our research project. We've provided up to 6 months of mental health support, knowing that like, people don't have a time frame for getting triggered. And this mental health support is free. And we've provided it for longer for people who've needed it. We have been very mindful of intersectional factors that certain women within academia face more violence because of intersectional factors like religion, race, caste, immigration status. And it's important for us to be mindful of these factors. I'm going to share my project link with you in a minute as well. And a big part of the project, like I was saying, is the ethics of redistribution. So everything on our project, everything on our website is copyleft. So whatever resources we put, take it, use it, our consent forms, participation information sheet, questions, whatever you need. And this comes from the acknowledgement that the work of addressing violence within institutions is often done by the most marginalized and precarious members of our community, and who often don't have the resources that our project has. So it is our responsibility to the people who are doing this work, often without resources, to make their burden lighter. So please do check out our website. Again, if you need anything, we are very happy to share it with you. But now coming back to the work that I wanted to present on India, and going back to the conversation around Me Too India. So let me tell you a little bit about what Me Too India was. So in October 2017, Raya Sarkar, a 24-year law student of Indian descent, posted a crowdsourced list on Facebook of male academics who allegedly harassed women. This came to be known as the list, and it led to the start of the Me Too movement in India, where universities became key spaces of discussion, debates, and activism. And this was like, on one hand, like, was because of the failure of university mechanisms, failure of the criminal justice, criminal legal system, but also the inherently capitalist, patriarchal, casteist nature of Indian academia. And following the list, like hundreds of women came out to share their stories of harassment and abuse, which led to a number of critical debates and conversations, right? There was like a lot of discussions also on how naming and shaming nature of the list. And but there was also like, naming and shaming is a broad tactic which is used by feminists for a very, very long time across the world from the 1970s. Uh, it also led to an ideological rift where some people said that why were these women going online when there was due process that exists in India? So let me tell you a little bit about what due process does exist. Like I was saying, in 1997, following the Vishaka judgment, which was one of the first cases where the Supreme Court gave a verdict against sexual harassment experienced by women within the workspace, the UGC, which is the Universities Grant Commission, like the big government body which regulates the workings of the university, mandated that every university develops guidelines to deal with sexual and gender-based violence within the institutions. The next landmark was the Nirbhaya case, which happened in 2012, which many of you may be aware about. It was the case where sorry, I should have given a trigger warning that I am going to talk a lot about sexual and gender-based violence and specific instances of that. So at any point, if you feel triggered or if you need to take a breather, please do so. So the Nirbhaya case, like, again, following that case, like there were several cases against, particularly in the university across India, which started coming out, which led to the UGC setting up a task force to review procedures for reporting and dealing with sexual harassment on campuses. The report was called Saksham Report, and the guidelines came to be known as the Saksham Guideline. I can link it after my talk in the chat, but it's an excellent resource, and it was led by a number of feminists. It's a great resource. And then in 2013, there was the Sexual Harassment in the Workspace Act, which came following which the UGC again regulated that the universities establish internal complaint committees to prevent, prohibit, and redress sexual violence and gender-based violence on campuses. It advocated universities to put like support mechanisms to have infrastructural development, sensitization mechanisms. But I mean, I'm telling you all of these like, mechanisms which exist to kind of point out that despite these laws and guidances, what I was interested in is that why were survivors turning to online spaces? And these online spaces are like, such like public spaces where they were talking about like quite traumatic incidents. So like, why were they doing that? So this led me to interview 7 people who had written online testimonies following the Me Too movement in India. And today I wanted to share with you very briefly some of the things that I found and which has been fundamental in shaping my research going forward from this. But before I say that, like one of the things I also did when I wrote up this paper was that in solidarity with the people who spoke out, I also did not cite any authors, academics, or activists who were either mentioned in any list or any other online disclosures. And this was to support an academic methodology and practice, which was survivor-centered and above all, like believed in survivors. So the other thing to mention is that these were not things like when I often present my research in India, people are like, oh my God, this is such a global majority problem. And it's such a brown woman problem. It's not. These are trends that we see across global higher education. And the first thing a number of people said was that they did not have faith in due process. And my research showed that many of the students and academic staff who fought for due process to be implemented in the institutions were also supportive of the list. And list, this is like, the Raya Sarkar's list, it came to be known as the list or Losha. And these were not young feminists who devalued due process, but were students who acknowledged that because of the power dynamics, hierarchies around Islamophobia, casteism, the patriarchal and, capitalist nature of Indian academia, because of the shame attached to any form of sexual violence, many of these mechanisms did not work. Right? Even in very, very progressive institutions across India, I found that victim blaming, slut shaming to be rife. Students saying that, and students and staff saying that as soon as they disclosed to their peer group, their friends stopped talking to them. Families refused to support them. And this was amplified in participants who came from marginalized backgrounds. The second thing that they all said was writing their stories in their own words was cathartic and healing. So writing helped them legitimize the feelings, and they stopped blaming themselves. And the process also helped them regain some control and subjectivity after it had explicitly been taken away. But the most important thing was that they were not alone in this experience. And through this, they found a community of people around them. And very often, survivors are isolated and said, this is a you problem. And I think breaking away from that to understand that this is not a you problem, it's a structural problem, was life-changing for many of them. One of the most interesting things that I found was that all the survivors I spoke to, their idea of justice was not fulfilled by a due process mechanism which criminalized people. So many of them, actually, in my interviews with all the 7 women, none of them actually asked for punishment for their perpetrators. So they were speaking out, they said, to stop the harm from happening, for them to change their behavior, and for that not to happen to anybody else. They did not speak about punishment. And it's important because how sexual and gender-based violence is still framed around, or they're doing this for revenge. They're doing this oh, what about the career of the poor boy? Or what about the career of this amazing academic? But none of them wanted their careers to stop. They just wanted the behavior to stop, right? So I think this was really important of why how one of the only solutions offered to them was punishment, and that's not what they want. They often actually asked for mental health support for the people who had perpetrated harm against them. They asked for, and another interesting thing was actually one of the people said that when they went to report, they didn't want their perpetrator to be punished, and because that was the only option that was afforded to them, they didn't report, because they were I know this person comes from a lower caste background, and if I report, there's a big chance that they may lose their job. Their mother and their sister depends upon their income. I know that, and I don't want their family to suffer. I don't want other women to suffer because of this. I just want him to stop. And there was no space for that within university mechanisms. So it also then urges us to think about how university mechanisms and what survivors want. There's no bridge between that. And finally, every single person I interviewed said that they did it because they did not want anybody else to go through this. And since now academic lives are transnational, they wanted this whisper network to be transnational as well. They wanted people to know, and they wanted to keep other people safe. And I'm going to end with this final thing of a number of survivors said that how speaking out online, like I was saying, shifted it from being a personal problem to a political or a structural issue. So a number of them were not involved with the feminist movements, campaigns, debates before, but through this process of disclosing and speaking out, it introduced them to the feminist movement. So as a result, for example, one of the people started a little organization in there, which has now grown to support other survivors within educational institution. Another survivor became part of what they call quote unquote, pretty badass women. And they started demanding for institutional change and better policies and practices within their university. So this realization also that they can use their lived experience doesn't define them, right? They are much more than that, and they can use it to become change was also extremely empowering for a lot of the people that I spoke to. So this whole thing of like, oh, you poor victims, they did not want that. They wanted them to be much more than their one experience. And I'm going to end by asking, a lot of people tell me in classrooms and conference and seminars that, how would you evaluate the Me Too movement or speak out movements like this? How successful do you think they are? And I just want to say that, first of all, movements like this can't be evaluated with capitalist metrics. That's not the point of movements. But also, movements like this are not the end. They're part of a much longer and wider history of feminist struggle and activism. And because of these many, many movements across the world, we have new allies who continue the feminist work in different ways. They continue to enrich feminist debates with their lived experiences. They continue to make our spaces more intersectional and inclusive. So I'm going to end here, and thank you for listening. I think I've gone a bit over time.
No, you're amazing. Thank you so much. That's fantastic. You're within time, not over at all. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Adrija. Do we have any questions from the room before we go to the chat and anything coming up in the chat? So what